land, from purchasing cars, from taking out loans, right? And because of that, we see that Black people, even though historically Black people have more familiarity with the land here than anyone else, because we work the land, we built the land, we built the infrastructures, right? We have more familiarity with the land, but we cannot own the land, right? We put in more work than any other group at the start of this country to build infrastructures, to build the economy, to create America's trade power in international economics, right? All the things that the United States was trading with other countries, the sugar, the cotton, the tobacco, the textiles. Black people were doing that labor and cannot benefit from that. That's beyond white people not liking us. That's beyond prejudices. That's beyond stereotypes, right? Those are institutions and systems that keep us from enjoying full citizenship, that keep us from enjoying our rights, that keep us from having safe births and healthy babies, that keep us from having sustainable families, that keep us from eating well, that keep us from living in safe communities and safe societies. And so I made this statement, and it's jarring at first, but if you really think about it and play with it, you know, it's the truth. There is no oppression, or no, I guess, there is no form of denial or really just oppression that Black people don't face in America that's not a result of racism, right? So there is no problem that Black people face in America that isn't a direct result of racism, whether it is our health, right? So if you look at the way Black neighborhoods are built by civil engineers, they build our neighborhoods in a way that a lot of times Black neighborhoods don't have access to produce, don't have access to fresh foods, don't have access to health care. And that has nothing to do with Black people. It's not because Black people are inherently less healthy. Black people don't like to be healthy. Black people don't like to be well. It's a result of systemic racism. And so there's no problem that Black people face in America that's not a result of racism. Whether it is our high infant mortality rate, the fact that Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die giving birth than white women, it's not because we're inherently less healthy. It's not because we don't know how to give birth. Most of the midwives in America throughout the 1800s and 1900s were Black women. Black women have been teaching everyone else how to give birth in this country. So it's not that we don't know how to give birth. It's because we are in medical systems that ignore Black women, that ignore the pain of Black women, or that experiment on Black women, right? The same thing with food, the same thing with incarceration. We are much more likely to be incarcerated than anyone else, and it's not because we commit more crimes. If you haven't read The New Jim Crow yet, I would say read that book, because it details with very specific facts and statistics and empirical data that Black people do not commit more crimes than white people. Black on Black crime is not really a thing any more than white on white crime. All crime is proximate. White people kill white people at the same amount that Black people kill Black people, right? So the term Black on Black crime in itself is racist, because it creates this narrative that, oh, Black people are inherently criminalistic. Black people themselves don't value Black lives. And that's simply not the case. We got spammed, but it's okay. We're still here.
I apologize for that. We'll take care of that right now.
No, it's okay. Widespread problem.
Nigga don't like to kill all the Black people. Kill all the Black
excuse me, brother.
like this happen to Black people and not really other people. Like, you'll never get on a Zoom call that's, you know, just a regular call with white people, and you'll hear people saying, kill all the white people. That will never happen. Like, it doesn't happen. And so it's beyond this just being a feeling or a sentiment about Black people, but we don't have safe spaces. Like, we can't even be safe on a Zoom call, right? And our ability to create in safe spaces doesn't exist. We are not allowed to keep ourselves safe. We are not allowed to defend ourselves. We are not allowed to create safe spaces for ourselves and exist in them and be happy without them being imposed upon by other people. And that's just, that right there is a prime example, right? This does not happen in other people's spaces or in other kinds of conversations. And so I really want to drive that home, that racism is not about feelings. It's not about liking these people or not liking other people. It's really about systems, institutions, laws, ideologies, and frameworks that enact oppression against Black people, not just not liking Black people, right? But actually oppressing Black people. incarcerating us, murdering us, taking away our children, denying us access to clean water and fresh foods, right? All of those things are part of systems that, those systems are what racism is, right? Another aspect of racism is a normalizing of whiteness. And we see this in a few different ways. It happens culturally, it happens in terms of music. For instance, if you're in an office space, right, and someone is gently playing Taylor Swift in the background, right? That's fine. It's white music, it's okay. But if I gently play a little bit of Missy Elliott in the background or something like that, then it's problematic because whiteness is normalized, right? The same thing with white hair, white outfits and things like that. Like the way that white women are allowed to wear their hair in public is normalized. Whereas if I wear my hair in a certain way, it's not. It's like, oh, what are those Bantu knots? What is that? Can I touch your hair? Can I do this? Because whiteness is normalized here. White body types are normalized in America, right? Whereas black body types are not. They're an anomaly. There's something to look at. There's something to gawk at. There's something to touch. There's something to make a spectacle out of. And so all of those are different ways that, you know, just whiteness is normalized here, and it's considered normal, whereas blackness is not normalized. And the further you are away from whiteness, then the more abnormal your existence is created here. And so what must change entail? Since we now know that racism is not just about feelings, but it's rather a set of institutions, laws, legalities, and frameworks that enact oppression, what must change are those systems, right? And so one of the things that's really hot right now, and it should be, is policing, right? And so what change entails with that is not just saying, okay, well, we need to criminalize these specific officers who did something bad, but actually looking at the whole system of policing and what about the whole system of policing is inherently racist, right? So from the beginning, police didn't always exist. Sometimes people have difficulty imagining a world without police because in their minds, it's like, oh, police always existed. Like we have to have police, and it's absolutely not true. It's a rather modern invention. And the way that we see police like this is rather unique to America. This is not an inherent thing about human civilization that we have police, right? Someone made that up, and rather recently. And the way that it was made up in America is out of slave patrols. And so America, coming out of chattel slavery, put together these groups of white men that would hunt down Black people who left the plantations or were runaway slaves. From that, they became routinized into regular police beats. And so police would routinely just check neighborhoods, right? So it went away from, okay, we need to put this group together to find this one runaway slave, to let's have a standing group that is always checking the neighborhoods to make sure Black criminal activity is not happening, right? That in itself is inherently racist. And a lot of those fundaments and that ideology that led to the conception of the police is still there. The way that police our communities is still very highly focused on Black criminality and no one else's criminality, but again, everyone commits crimes at the same rate. The way Black police, not Black police officers, all police officers treat Black bodies is inherently different than the way that they treat white bodies. And it's because of how police were conceived of in the beginning. And so when we're saying like, oh, we're demanding change in the police, we're not just demanding the criminalization of a few officers, we have to fundamentally overturn and rethink what policing looks like, right? To the point where we say we might want to dismantle the police. And so change entails a drastic overview and an overhaul of all of the systems that contribute to the oppression of Black people in America, which is everything from the housing system to child family services, to the kinds of lunches they give in schools, to the medical facilities. I mean, all institutions that exist in America, if they weren't founded by Black people, and sometimes unfortunately, even if they were, have a lot of racism in them. And so change entails us taking a very close look at all the institutions, the laws, the frameworks, and really taking a look at how they impose oppression on Black people. The last question I want to address is, should we forgive the past? No, the best apology is change behavior. And so there's no past to forgive when a lot of these things are still present, right? We can't say, oh, let's forgive the past of Jim Crow, or let's forgive the past of racism, or the past of oppression, or the past of lynching. Black people are still being lynched, y'all. Like, to this day, we are still being lynched. We can't forgive that. I cannot forgive lynching if I'm still being lynched. I cannot forgive the over-criminalization of Black bodies if we're still being over-criminalized. I cannot forgive the fact that modern gynecology was built on experimenting on Black women, right? Like, let me take this Black woman who's pregnant, lay her on a table, cut her wide open, see what happens, right? Let's take her ovaries out, see what happens. Let's not give her anesthesia. Let's see how much pain they can tolerate. I cannot forgive what's happening in modern medical institutions, in hospitals, and maternity wards until that's no longer the case. And so it's the same way, like, you know, if your spouse commits some type of wrong against you and they're like, oh, forgive me, I will forgive you once you stop doing that, right? I can forgive my best friend for doing something if I see that you've actually made a change, but if not, I'm just wasting my forgiveness and setting myself up and potentially creating some type of mental disorder with myself because I'm trying to pretend like a change happened that didn't. And so we will forgive the past once it's actually in the past. Until then, there's nothing that can be forgiven. That's it.
Thank you so much, sister. I really appreciate those. Those are very insightful words. You know, fundamentally, the most important thing at the beginning of this conversation is to understand the history, right? Why can we not progress now if we don't understand where we were? If we don't understand where we were, we can't go anywhere, right? So being able to understand, fundamentally, what is our past, what are the mistakes we've made, and how we can address them in the future is the basis for an action plan. When we look at businesses, they first say, all right, where's the past 2 years of performance? So then we can evaluate and go for the next, year of performance. You mentioned, lynching, and it reminded me of a conversation we had the first time someone used that, heard that term in one of our discussion groups. They said, wow, that's a very vulgar word. That's a very intense language. It's not really lynching. You said, okay, if we use words that are more comfortable to you, would that help you? But that defeats the purpose, right? If you're desensitizing people from the very beginning of the conversation, we can't have further conversation. So feeling that shock is important. And I think you highlighted that very nicely. And I think it's important that, all right, I'm out of my comfort zone. That's the point, right? And alhamdulillah, we have, a lot of, community members who say, hey, why are we being so vicious about this topic and, being very, very, hardcore and go straight away at the heated points, and they say, where else should we start? We don't start there, right? We need to prioritize somewhere. So I think you made a phenomenal point, and it's very important to know our history, as we try to move forward. And I encourage folks to please continue sending, your discussion questions if you have, your thoughts, your questions for our panelists, so we can address them as well. You can also feel free to private message either myself or other, the chat monitor, Brother Amir Purman, as well. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Sister Hidaya Nawee to present. Sister Hidaya is a writer, speaker, and activist whose work predominantly focuses on issues of race, gender, and religion. Sister Hidaya, it is all yours.
Assalamu alaikum. Can everybody hear me?
Alaikum assalam. Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay. So first of all, I want to say thank you so much for having me. And sister, thank you very much. That was like, I was like nodding along and clapping along to everything you were saying. So thank you for that. I kind of want to move in a slightly different direction a little bit, which I want to talk about a question that I've gotten a lot over the last few days, especially over the last week, which is that how do we start the conversation about these things that are happening in our world right now, whether it's with our families or with our children or just people that we know that might be, for lack of a better word, ignorant about these things. And the first thing that I always say is that we recognize that there is a problem, right? And how do we recognize there's a problem? We ask. So for instance, if you don't, just as like a general example, if you don't talk to the women in your centers, you're not going to find out what they're dealing with on the women's side, right? So it's very much the same, that if you do not talk to the people who are different from you, who attend your sacred space, your center, your masjid, whatever it is, then you're not going to know what it is that they're dealing with. And you're not, however well-intentioned you are, you're not going to be able to implement the changes that they need to see in order to feel comfortable in those spaces. And then the second thing I'll say is, once we start having these discussions, you have to have akhlaq, always. You can't, there can't be any kind of like name calling or yelling at people who don't get you or what you're saying. We have to start from a place of respect, because if you don't start from a place of respect, then people are automatically checking out, no matter how valid what you're saying is. Okay, now it's different if whatever the space is you're talking about, if they've already progressed in a certain way and now they're just complacent, that's different, right? Because then we know that there's a problem. So as an example of this, let's say that your board in your sacred space, whether it's your MSA or your center or your mosque, has 20 people on it, 20 people. And let's say like 5 years ago, they were all men, right? And now there are 2 women out of 20. Yeah, that's progress, but we can't stop there, right? So in that way, because there's a recognition of the problem, you can be a little bit more, I don't want to say forceful, but you can definitely push a little bit harder, because we've gotten here and we can't stop here. Okay, so, and then another facet of this is, specifically when we're talking to our elders, there hasn't been the opportunity to have these conversations properly, because a lot of our elders are saying, well, we have been discriminated against too, right? And that's valid. They're right. We can't negate that. So, but what we need to be able to do is to talk about the fact that the struggles of people in Black bodies, people with Black skin, is very different from the people who are from any other country, no matter what that country is, right? I heard someone say very recently during another talk that I was doing that, a lot of the people of color can blend in with white people, right? And that in itself is something that, we need to recognize and be able to talk about. So yeah, that's one thing I'll say. And then the other question is kind of, why should we even care about this, right? Like, why does this matter? And the short answer is that it's the Islamic thing to do. If absolutely nothing else, if you don't have Black people in your family, if you don't know any Black, if you have no other reason to care, we need to recognize that this is the Islamic thing to do. So Islam tells us that every life, a life is a life is a life. And so that has to be translated in how we deal with people who look different from us in our communities, right? Everyone should feel comfortable in our spaces and in our world, but more specifically in our centers, because we have a higher responsibility both as Muslims and furthermore, like as followers of the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam, we have an even bigger responsibility, right? So, and then I've also gotten questions about like effective allyship, right? What do we do? Once we've had this conversation, we recognize that there's a problem, where do we go from there? The first thing, and I I sound like a broken record here because I've said this over and over again, is checking your implicit biases. And implicit here, for those of you who don't know, is, you know, inferred or implied, but not plainly stated. So all of the, let's call them benefits of the doubt that you would give to a white person if you saw them doing something, you have to afford that to Black people as well. And to give you like a very simple example, let's say you're walking down the street, right? And you see someone like crawling through a window. What do you assume about that person, right? Or someone breaking a lock to a house. If they're white, do you assume, oh, you know, she probably forgot her keys? You know, and if they're Black, do you then switch to, oh my God, are they stealing? That's an implicit bias. So if you have anything that looks or feels like that, stop right there. You know, address, why do you feel that way? Because there's always a reason why. So go back to that and, you know, address that in yourself. And then if need be, in your family as well, right? Because we can't start addressing these global issues if we don't fix what's right in front of us first. And then the other thing I will say is read widely and read differently, and not just read to kind of say, oh, you know, we had it harder, or this or that or the other thing. I call that the oppression Olympics, where it's like, who's more oppressed than the other person, right? Let's not engage in that. If you're going to read a book by, let's say, a Black author about their struggles, you need to read that book and listen, you know, without any judgment, without any opinions first, right? You can have opinions after you're done reading the book. And Shakai, you recommended a book, so I'm going to recommend a book as well. I know a lot of people have asked me about this, but I recommend Between the World and Me. Is a very, very powerful book about these kinds of issues. It's by a pretty famous author, Ta-Nehisi Coates. I'm sure you all have heard of him, but he tells his own story. And the book is actually written for his son, right? So he's kind of talking to his son as he's writing this book, as a Black man, about the things that he's gone through in this country. So yeah, definite recommendation on that one. Another thing you can do is you can support Black businesses and Black efforts in your community. And if you're able to, like, you know, if you have hiring power in your company and you know of someone who needs a job, hire them. Or if you don't and you know someone like that, take a resume and put in a good word for them, right? Because all of these things, like shooting of police officers shooting Black men and women, like that didn't start overnight, right? It started with all of these implicit things that we have. And one of those things is that Black people are inherently less educated than white people. So destigmatize that, you know, like the largest group of educated people in America, at least, is Black women. And a lot of people don't even know that. So yeah, break those stereotypes for yourself and make sure that, you know, whatever the effort is, because the issue is that if we don't support those Black men and women who are making the efforts to do all of these things, then no one else will, right? There are a lot of mom and pop shops owned by Black men and women in this country that struggle because no one will buy from them, right? So that's something you can do, and to be an effective ally in this fight. The other thing that I'll end with, that I have been asked a lot about in the last few days also, is like, how do I explain what's going on right now to like little kids, especially if I'm not Black, right? How do I even explain like race relations in this country to my children if I'm not Black? So the way that I will answer this is to say that talking about race and race relations is traumatic, right? For especially for us, you know, Black people, right? And so I wouldn't necessarily say that like it's a good burden to put on a child. You don't have to explain everything to a child, but before we even get there, right? Before a body even becomes a hashtag, what you can do is you can read your children's stories that feature Black children, right? Or center Black voices in them. There are a lot of, you know, bedtime stories for kids now that have, you know, lots and lots of Black characters. So yeah, that's something you can definitely do. Oh, and sort of related to that, I'll say, like, I sort of alluded to it before, but don't always put the burden of discussing race and race relations on us as Black men and women. It's exhausting sometimes. So what does that look like in practice? It looks like, well, if you know that there's an issue and you go to someone and you're like, well, we have this issue, and they say, oh, well, you're not Black, so you couldn't possibly know about that. Then you bring in, you know, someone to talk about this and to teach you. Or if you have a question about something, then you bring it in. But to have us be the ones who constantly have to be like, well, we have this problem, and not get listened to is difficult, right? So start the conversations in your centers, and then let us back you up if need be. But if I, as a Black woman, don't have the privileges you enjoy in your space, chances are I'm not going to be able to even get very far talking about these things. So yeah, I don't want to take, you know, forever. So I'll just leave it there, and inshallah we'll have more discussions during the Q&A portion.
Thank you so much, sister. I really appreciate your words. They're very inspiring. I think your last point about creating a space for your brothers and sisters, it can be exhausting. And I think for a lot of us who may not identify specifically with the Black struggle, is that you have your own struggle, right? Now imagine I, as an Iranian person, right, I want to talk about political justice, right? But I'm at a very conservative university, for example, and there's no space for me, right? How do you expect for you to get your voice heard, right? You have an ally who creates a space, who helps create a space for you. You don't have to insert yourself into every conversation. You want other individuals to create that space for you within your community, wherever it is that you are. So if you're in your mosque or your center, right, you're creating that space, right? And that, I think, at the end of the day, or at the beginning, I should say, it starts with that bond, with that friendship, right? I should have a bond with my, Black friends, with my Black community members, right? If I have that bond, it'll allow me to build that space, right? And it's unfortunate that we have to make it intentional. It should be automatic, right? It should be something that's within us, that we want to be inclusive of everyone. But societal factors have conditioned us to focus on ourselves, right? To focus on certain individuals. So I don't want to take too much time. Inshallah, we'll have a lot of time to discuss in the Q&A portion, and please continue to send your questions. I'd like to invite Sister Zahra Ali to present us with a few words on, a few poetic words, I should say, on being an ally and the importance of unity. So Sister Zahra, pull up your bio. So Sister Zahra attended Wentworth Institution of Technology in Boston, Massachusetts. She has been writing poetry since she was young. It has always been a form of art used to express herself. Now, as a college student, she uses poetry to raise her voice against injustices in the world and speak for the truth with the guidance of the Creator. Sister Zahra, it's all yours.
Can you hear me fine?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So before I start, I did want to mention that I, as a non-Black person, is in no way speaking on this as a story of my own. This is a piece I have written for my fellow Black brothers and sisters in justice that they have been facing for over 300 years. So with that, I will start. So here I am in the midst of a pandemic, riding on a virus that's been here in the form of a corrupt systematic. And I'm not talking about corona or none of that flu, but rather a chronic virus that's been present with no vaccine because it is being brushed with the color blue. My heart aches. My heart aches for Trayvon Martin. My heart aches for Eric Garner, Philando Castile, Michael Brown, Sandra Bland, Tamir Rice, Stephon Clark, Alton Sterling, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery. My heart aches for George Floyd. And my heart aches for the list that goes on and on of my Black brothers and sisters. The ones who have their melanin run through their bloodlines, the same bloodlines that are being cut in broad daylight of the sun, the same bloodlines that are leaving blood stains from the bullets of a gun. Sounds of a bullet have become way too familiar. Coming straight from a white trigger, they call this America. The land of the free, they said, where the color of the skin determines whether you can keep your hands in your pocket without a gun, where you have to look out for your life while going on a run, where Black mothers' tears come down like rain, but none are able to wash away the blood stain. They call this America. The land of the free, they said, where you are shot dead before freedom can come out as a twist from your tongue, because freedom is a twist in America. You don't get freedom under that Black skin when a white knee is choking your breath away. You don't get freedom under that Black skin when you can't play cops and robbers growing up. You don't get freedom under that Black skin carrying a bag of Skittles. You don't get freedom under that Black skin walking from one street to another, jogging from one street to another, living in one street or another, breathing from one second or another. Freedom in America means your soul has to leave your Black body behind under a white knee. But this knee isn't the same knee that is kneeled down for Black lives, but it is the knee that took a Black life. It is the knee of white privilege. Same knee that's knocked down 400 years of life of a race. That life that as a Black man, you have to work 10 times harder in a country that was built on your ancestors' back for your soul to leave your body by a white man that will attack. The life that you aren't raised with children rhymes, or rather you are taught how to deal with the police. Don't resist, don't run, don't get a ticket, don't have fun, don't sing at church in spirit, and especially under any circumstances, don't own a toy gun, or a Black mother or a Black father will lose a daughter or a son, or a Black daughter or a son will lose a mother or a father, and this is the freedom of America, the land of the free. They tell you to protest peacefully, but when you do, they assassinate Martin and Malcolm. They throw tear gas at you so they can blind you to stand during the American anthem. They shoot you with rubber bullets so they can hurt you away from the right view. They speak of freedom of choice, but they also arrest you and strip you away from your voice. They'll kneel down for the camera, but behind that same camera, they take away another Black life. So enough is enough. Check your privilege and help out your Black brothers and sisters. Stand up for justice the way Hussein and his family did. We're forgetting what makes us strong is our unity. The same way birds together fly by, ants work together to accomplish high, or how wolves hunt in packs. The painter paints and we see, the creator creates and we learn from he, and he is the one who created the different colors of beauty. Black, white, and brown, except why is it that under all the paint, Black is the one to drown? You don't have to be white to own privilege. It's the privilege that's given to people like me, to people who don't own the color of the Black skin, who don't own the melanin of beauty, yet our community still uses languages that drown out Black voices. Tell me, why is white and brown still allowed to breathe while Black is being stripped away from that choice? We claim to love Khadija and Muhammad, Fatima and Ali, Hassan and Hussein, yet we pick and choose on whose fight we call our own pain. We live a fast-paced life in our brain. We're not a machine. The strength of a machine may be its parts, but the strength of a man is another man's heart. There are ways we can unite and ways to split apart. To unite together as an ally without fear, have trust in the Most High, and keep fighting for the Black lives, because all lives don't matter until Black lives matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sister Zahra. I'm pausing to digest, to understand some of the metaphors that you made, mashallah. Beautiful. And, this form of expression, I think, is magnificent, because every form of expression resonates with a different audience. Right? How do I get my message to, different folks? Mashallah, this resonated a lot with me. Engaging in the gears in my mind in order for me to be able to think of strategies of what I can be better at. In all forms of this art, help perpetuate that. Right? You know, someone says, oh, you know, I should, you know, post something on Instagram, right? And the other person says, hey, you know, Instagram won't do anything. Maybe for some person, Instagram is their only form of, you know, learning of that, to their key to the outside world, right? We know people like that, you know, for good or bad, right? Other people, they won't read a full article, right? But they'll read a 5-line poem. So the beauty of I think this allyship is communicating this message in ways that is digestible fully to each individual. You know, to one person, I have to call them up and say, hey, you know, let's talk about this serious issue. The other person, all it takes for that gear to click is for us to have lunch and say, wow, this food is really good. I want to meet the chef. Who's that chef? It's a Black person. I have this connection now. Wow, my understanding of this individual, of this population has changed. Why? Because of this chef. Right? Understanding how can I communicate this message to different people through different mediums. And poetry is one of the most, I think, effective for a lot of us. So thank you so much for sharing. And, you know, inshallah, we'll you know, hear more from you as well in you know, future programs. So now, you know, we want to turn it over to more of the interactive component. Folks, if you have questions, please, you know, enter them in the chat, and we have Brother Amir who will compile them for us. First, Sister Niciah and Sister Hidaya, I wanted to start off specifically within the context of Islamic societies. What are ways that we unknowingly perpetuate this racism and have these implicit biases within the Islamic centers, Islamic communities, and beyond just, you know, why do we not have Black people on the board? Right? Beyond, you know, bringing more Black speakers, Black, you know, youth coordinators, right? What are some things that are systemically within our Islamic communities not functioning properly, and what are some practical strategies that we can address? Sister Niciah, we'll start with you, please.
So I think a few of the points that you made already immediately came to mind, like, okay, there's never enough lecturers, right? There's never enough Black scholars. And it always puts in people's mind, like, again, like, Black people aren't studied, Black people aren't scholars, Black people aren't writing the books, Black people aren't in the seminaries teaching your favorite sheikhs, and we are. And so I'm glad that you named that. It's important. And having us on the boards are very important, right? And so I'm glad that you named those, and you already have an awareness of that, and that is something that IAC can, you know, work more actively on. But I think conversations like this are important, and they don't happen enough. And when I was invited to the conversation originally, I gave some pushback and said, well, you know what, this should be a series, because one conversation is not going to do it. And this is why. These conversations, these have to be regular. It has to be part of our regular routine exercise, that we flex our thinking, our spirits, our commitment to Islam in ways that say these conversations have to happen, and then actions have to come from them. And so the next step after these conversations is putting together a very specific and actionable group of commitments that Mujahid can make. So this particular match has to come and sit down and say, what are the action steps that we're willing to make? Are we willing to, you know, some of the ways that we support businesses are inviting them to cater events. How many Black businesses do we support per year? Who do we pay, right? How many Black, when we have Islamic schools, how many Black teachers you have in here, right? IAC used to have a lot of Black teachers. How many Black teachers do we have, right? When we hold scholarships, how many scholarships do we reserve for Black students? That's important. And sometimes people say, you know, affirmative action, people have called that reverse racism, which is absolute nonsense. But affirmative action type things are necessary, because that is how you correct the fact that we have systemically been denied access to education, because we are, right? I had a teacher in high school. I will never forget her. She's very well educated. And she was one of the first person from which I learned that ghetto Black girls are smart. She was real ghetto and real smart and had a lot of real good degrees. And it made me feel comfortable being a ghetto Black girl in the University of Notre Dame, right? Just a very white space. But she told me one day that one of her colleagues at American University was like, oh, you're only here because of affirmative action. And she said, well, then it's working. Because someone should be here because of affirmative action, and I'm grateful that it's me. And so we have to take steps like that to actively reverse. It's not good enough to say, okay, well, racism is bad and the exclusion from institutions is bad, and let's just stop it. Now you got to reverse that. Like, you got to say, okay, if we've been excluding people, how can we actively include them? right? And so that's super important. But again, like coming out of these conversations with an actionable list of commitments is super important, because that's what enjoining the good and forbidding the bad looks like, right? You have to first learn what the good is and learn what the bad is in order to enjoin the good and forbid the bad. And Allah won't change the condition of people until they change themselves, right? And so until we can continue to have these conversations, we can't get rid of the implicit bias. Until we continue to make commitments, then we can't reverse all the racism that we have been complicit in. And Sister Hidaya made a good point that the more you can blend in with whiteness, the more access to white privilege you have. And so if you're not actively using that to dismantle white supremacy, you are part of the problem. And so we have to actually take steps. Those of us who have more proximity to whiteness, and this even in the Black community, light skin privilege is a thing, right? Petite privilege is a thing, right? Because Eurocentric standards say if you light skin and petite, that's where it's at. And so you have to use your privilege to say, okay, I have more proximity to white privilege, and so how will I use that to dismantle white supremacy?
No, I think that's very on point. And before I turn it over to Sister Taya, I had a quick question as a follow-up. So if we reconceptualize, right, the notion that this is a struggle that is pertinent to us, that we need to include in our communities, but we transfer this and put it on the same level, for some of our older members or other members of our community as, the struggle in Syria, right? The struggle in Libya is by equating those and saying, hey, this is something that is just as relevant, that is just as, crucial, right? Because we pay so much attention to Syria, Pakistan, all these places. This is, similar to that. Is that something that is that a course of action that you recommend? Or is that part of the same, line of thinking that is saying that, all right, that's, the all lives matter. And we're equating this struggle with everybody else. Where does that strategy fall in line?
I honestly think it depends on the community. Some people couldn't stomach it if you said Black Lives Matter is more important because you're here and you're actively part of this every day. Some people could not stomach that. They would automatically say, that's enough. I can't sign on. I will not come to this program. I cannot help. Like, so some people that would be so repulsive to tell them that, your complicity in white supremacy is actually more problematic than these things overseas, right? And so in those communities, it may be helpful to draw those parallels to kind of to get rid of the cognitive dissonance, right? Because there's a cognitive dissonance that occurs when you say, well, this is a problem overseas, but this is not a problem here, right? Or these problems happen in Syria, these problems happen where my people are from, but we need to worry about that and not this. That's a cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance is it's a mental thing that has to be overcome, and it has physical repercussions. So for people who have that kind of cognitive dissonance, you might have to draw those parallels, but you have to read the room, know who you're talking to, know who you're dealing with, and know the history of the community that you're dealing with. And knowing the history of the communities is so important. It's so, because some communities you don't have to do that. You don't have to do that, but some you do.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Sister Hidaya, I want to pass it over to you.
I was going to say, first of all, I completely agree with everything Niciah is saying, but I wanted to sort of bring it back to the more day-to-day aspects. So what this looks like is not assuming every Black person in the space is a convert. Okay, that's something you can do every day. If somebody walks into a space that you don't know and they don't look like you, don't assume that, don't assume that I don't know anything about Islam, I've had people offer to help me do wudu, and I'm like, why? Like, why are you here?
I can help you.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I can help you, but yeah, just sort of little things like that. So not helpful, and sort of designed to make Blackness and Islam seem mutually exclusive, and they're not, right? We know from the history of Islam that the Prophet himself would center the marginalized groups of the Arabs, so that's why you hear so much about Salman al-Farisi and Bilal, and because all these people are people who did not look like the Arabs of that time, and people who very famously got ridiculed for that, right? So yeah, don't assume anything about anyone. Ask, you know, because if you do not ask and you assume, that internalization of that assumption becomes an implicit bias. And that's what we're trying to break away from. So.
Thank you. No, that's very, it's a daily point, right? It's about that changing that little bit every single day that'll allow you to chip away at the bigger block of the issue. So I want to transition. We had a question submitted. It says, how do we recognize that there is an issue within our community, right? I'm oblivious to issues, and I'm just understanding about these issues today. How do we recognize that there's an issue?
Again, I think part of it goes back to knowing the history of your community and your masjid. Very important, because that will tell you whether there are no Black people on the board because they haven't been invited, or if they've been pushed off, or if they're just not interested, or if you have made active attempts to include Black people in your community and they say, nah, we good. Knowing those things and being active in your community allows you to know, like, okay, either we're taking steps or we just sitting here and we're complicit. You're not actively taking steps to have these conversations, to include Black people, to give Black people leverage, to invest in our communities, and you're part of the problem. But you won't know if your community is doing that or not if you're not active in your community. And so as Muslims, it's important for us at all times to be active in our communities, because that's the only way that you know if you're actively engaging in prophetic ministry versus just pastoral ministry. Pastoral ministry is important. Pastoral ministry is concerned with the hereafter and saving souls, right? Primarily. Prophetic ministry is the work of prophets. We're building a nation. We are dismantling oppression, right? We are freeing the slaves. That's prophetic ministry, right? And you won't know if your community is doing one or the other, and if it's doing one or the other well, if you're not active. You know, if you're just showing up to pray and you rolling out, that's not gonna cut it, because you don't know if your whole master is showing up to pray and rolling out. You don't know what's happening. And so being actively engaged and knowing the history of your community's active engagement, you know, with anti-racism fronts is super important. Ask those questions. Ask your board, ask your leaders, ask your imam what's been going on.
Thank you, Sister Hidaya. Do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, I agree. I think everything starts with figuring out where your community is at, you know, because that also gives you the idea of where to start the conversation. And this is what I was talking about earlier, where I was saying with everything you have to start with akhlaq, right? But with communities that are a little bit further ahead with these kinds of things, you know where to push a little bit better, right? So if your community is normally like, what's a Black person, right? Versus a community that has 5 people who are Black on the board, right? Those are different points. And the way you approach the work that still needs to be done in those communities is going to be very different. So yeah, finding out where you are at, and kind of starting from there. And that looks different for every community,
yep.
Right? So I can't tell you like, this is where you start. But with everyone, it starts with dialogue, right? It starts with talking to people and saying, okay, what are, and I said this before, like the first steps of activism is observing, right? We don't start out as activists. We watch, we talk to people, we interact, we read, and then you figure out, okay, this is what I need to see, right? And yes, someone said forming relationships. Yeah, absolutely. And then the next step is figuring out, okay, well, I've talked to these people, I've read these things, now I know that there's this problem. And then you go about actively trying to fix it. So I think just, try to start there.
I want to double back some on the importance of knowing the histories of our communities, Noma made a really good point, and I want to relate this. So the reason we are lovers of the Ahlul Bayt is because we know Islamic history. No shade to everybody else, but like, we have studied the history, we know what happened, and we say, you know what, this something ain't right, you know, and it forms our allegiances, right? And it shapes the way we identify with and relate to Islam because we know history. And so for us, for all Muslims, it's super important that we know our history and we study. That is part of the requirements of being Muslim, is studying. And for some, again, it looks like studying through Instagram, some it looks like reading books, some it looks like watching documentaries or having these kind of conversations. But the followers of the Ahlul Bayt in particular, it is beholden upon us to know our histories, because that's what makes us distinct. That's what makes us who we are, is because we have a grasp on the history, and that's so important. And so we gotta keep that going in all forms. And Noma brought up that a lot of Muslims and Islamic communities don't know that, you know, as we continue to assume that Black Muslims aren't scholars, or Black Muslims are reverts, or don't necessarily have their own place in Islam. Islam came to America because of Black Muslims. We started it here. Y'all benefiting from it. Congratulations. Like, but if you don't know that, then you think like, oh, we have a monopoly on, I'm sorry, no, that was not shitty. But it's like, we have a monopoly on Islam when it's not, no, y'all coming to the table that we've already built. You don't acknowledge that. You don't name that because you're not studying the history of Islam in this context, but we have to. And that's your job. That's not our job to teach this history. It's your job to care enough about Islam to know what it looks like here.
Right. No, that's you hit the nail on the head. That's excellent. I'd like to take a small tangent towards allyship, specifically within Muslim American non-Black allies. I'll explain my question in a second. So unfortunately, I think that we have an issue where we're a little bit of self-deprecating at times, in the inherent point of positive intent, but not doing enough. Right? I'll give you an example. I recently had someone message me and say, this program you're doing, right? It's not good, right? It needs to be, you have to have 50 people, right? You have to have 50 speakers. You have to be doing all of these things, and that made me think of a comment one of our brothers had said. One of the brothers had said he posted something on Instagram that said, Black Lives Matter, right? And then another ally came and told him, hey, you're not doing enough, right? You need to be doing better, and that's not how you represent the Black Lives Matter movement, right? And then the brother told me, he said, listen, maybe it's better I don't post anything at all, right? So how can allies support allies, right? Some people, they're much farther ahead in this, path of mental and spiritual and personal reform, right? And they have this expectation for what it means to be an ally, right? But sometimes they don't understand or don't recognize that, someone who is, their eyes have just been opened, right? They're just on the path, and they tend to criticize, right? So what is the balance between, I want my fellow allies to be doing things at the best of their ability, and if they're going to say something, to maximize that, but also I don't want to over criticize them. I want to allow them to, support in a medium that they're comfortable with. How do we navigate that as allies to support the Black community?
So Nora brought up Centering the Black Muslim Narrative by Dawud Walid. Another really good book that he has is, I don't know, it might look backwards to y'all. That's probably not helpful. Towards Sacred Activism, though, by Dawud Walid is another really good book. One of the ways that we hold space for people who are, who are evolving in their consciousness, right? Yeah, it's such a good book. Yes, both of those. Very important books. We hold space by educating gently. And this happens in the Black community as well, right? Like those of us who've been woke be like, oh no, you should have, or no, you should have been new, or we've been saying, and it's like, at some point you didn't know this either, right? So we have to be gentle with each other and realize that we're mirrors for one another. So you see someone who's saying like, oh, all lives matter, you have to realize at some point that you didn't know why Black Lives Matter was the real answer. You have to remember that, because if you hadn't been that person at some point, it wouldn't be so appalling to you when you see someone say all lives matter. If you hadn't made that evolution in your own personal consciousness, then you wouldn't be looking at somebody saying they ain't woke enough, right? And so you hold space for them to learn by educating gently, the same way you hold space for your former self who didn't know everything you know now. That person is just a mirror of you, right? This dunya is a whole facade. It's reflections and smoke and mirrors, right? So you gotta gently hold space for people to learn, because that's what good teachers do. They don't come and shove everything like, oh, you gotta change. Prophet, peace be upon him, did not change everything in one day. Baby steps. First, we're gonna start. Let's just start with this, okay? Just start here. Just do a little bit, right? Remember that time that Moses was told, you gotta, I mean, the prophet, peace be upon him, was told, y'all gotta pray 50 times. And Moses was like, nah, ain't it. Let's lower that down some. Well, how about this number? Ain't it. You can't give people too much and shove too much, because then you can enter a state of shock or a state of paralysis, like the brother mentioned, where it's like, I can't do anything now.
And then you just stop doing anything at all.
And you just stop. So
and that's worse than doing something not fully the right way.
Yeah, we have to be gentle with one another and educate gently. And that again, my research was about the role of education in prophetic ministry. And that education part is so important, because you just, the same way you educate a child, just a little bit. Don't eat with that hand, just a little bit. You don't come and say, oh, don't do that. You just, because then the child will be turned away. The child will say, I can't do anything right. My self-worth is low. I don't want to try. It will never be good enough. I don't even want to talk to my parents. My deen will never be strong enough. I don't want to come to the masjid, right? That's what we don't want to do. Right. Gentle education with hugs.
Push but not,
privilege
push but not shove.
Privilege. Right. And acknowledge that it's a privilege to be well-read. Acknowledge that it's a privilege to be woke and to have a higher level of consciousness. And when you know you have a privilege, and you're gentle with the other people.
Thank you. Sister Hidaya, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, in this topic of like gentle teaching, a lot of times when we bring up like anti-Blackness, and in our communities, people are like, well, we love Bilal, so we're not racist, And when you really think about the story of Bilal, right? What did the Prophet do? First of all, these racist Arabs came to him and were like, well, he's Black, why is he even here? And, like there was so much of this happening, and the Prophet was like, okay, here's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna take this man who is dark, who is from a whole other country, who has a lisp, and I'm gonna make you hear his voice loudly.
Very day.
And not just like loudly, like I'm talking, no, loudly. You could hear him from 3 blocks away. Okay? So, but what does that mean in today's terms? Centering of the voices, right? He didn't say anything, he didn't do anything. And then when they came to him and were like, what are you doing? There are all these Arabs who speak better Arabic. No, Allah hears it differently. Right? So it does not always have to be a fight with people. You can find ways to subtly send a message.
And it takes so much energy to fight with people.
Yes, it does.
To the point where you're using all your energy to argue with somebody and tell them why they should have known better. You're not even doing nothing but arguing with that person. You didn't do nothing for the movement all day. You didn't do nothing to eradicate white supremacy all day, but argue with this one person who had their best intentions. God bless them. And you out here mad. So much energy, and you're squandering it. Don't internalize that when people squander their energy on you, because it's misdirected. It's misguided, and a lot of people have misdirected anger, and sometimes it makes people feel big to attack other people's knowledge instead of them actually taking big actions and making change out in the world. So don't internalize that.
Oh, that's excellent. I do want to be mindful of time. We only have 10 more minutes. This discussion could continue for many hours, and it will in the form of other parts, but we do want to be mindful of East Coast and folks' time. We'll address 3 more questions. Sister Zahra mentioned, how should we respond to performative action? For example, the DCBLM mural.
Hidaya, I'm gonna let you take that one. I have a lot of feelings.
Okay. Okay, so how do we? I mean, here's what I'll say, just to keep it short. We can't really. I feel like everybody has a role in this, right? So you're not about to tell somebody that they shouldn't write a poem and they should go protest instead, right? If that person's capacity is putting pen to paper, then that is that person's capacity. And we need everybody in this fight. Everyone needs to show up. So whatever your talent is, that's how you show up. And it's not my place to say, oh, we don't need this, we don't need that. No, even if all you can do is cook, go make some food for these people who are out here protesting. Okay, there is room for everyone. If you have money to donate, then donate. If you see the police harassing somebody and you can jump in with your white privilege and help that person, even if you weren't at the protest, do that. You know, so it's not my place to say that, you know, performance, you know, kind of allyship is it's terrible, you know, because I mean the fake activism thing is annoying, right? But at the same, like it's just it's hard to say what is and what isn't, right? Because on the one hand, because we need everybody using their voice, right? Even if it's performative, they can reach a person that's not going to perform. Does that make sense? So I have a lot of feelings too about this, right? Because those of us who are trying to do it the best way we know how, it's exhausting, right? And for you to kind of pull through and be like, oh, I'm just gonna like hold the sign in my cutesy tank top and makeup at a protest, you know, like it's, but anyway, there's room for everyone. Yes, it's really annoying, but I try to look at the one person or two people that this person might potentially reach that are not going to be out there, you know, just performing for the sake of performing.
So I think on the one hand, and you raised an excellent point, it's important to acknowledge that first there's room for everything in the struggle and in the movement. Like protesters is hungry and tired, okay? Like we need people out there handing out masks, okay? We need somebody out there handing out dinners. We need therapists on the front line saying, okay, this is traumatic. Can I give you some pro bono services, right? We need spiritual wellness facilitators saying, okay, we need safe spaces to talk. Let's hold that space, right? All of that is part of the movement. All that's part of the struggle. And really, all that is part of Islam. Like Islam doesn't devalue any of that work. The nursing mothers are part of the struggle, are part of the movement, right? Especially if you know the history of Black breastfeeding and Black birthing in this country. That's important, right? But at the same time, we also have to acknowledge that while all of those things have a role, all those things are important, we do have to also acknowledge, and Sister Hidaya, you said this, everyone's capacity is different, right? So if your capacity is to write, you do that. If your capacity is to raise your children with liberated consciousness, you do that. But if your capacity is to defund the police and you out here making paintings, that's a problem. That's not your capacity. Yeah. Now, if it is your full capacity to create a mural, that's what you have, that's important. Art is a form of protest. But Muriel, that's not your capacity. And we have to name that. And part of speaking truth to power is saying like, okay, the performance art is cute, but that's not your capacity. Had it been a group of artists who said, we're gonna do this, that's important, but that's not what happened, right? And so that's not the mayor's capacity. Yeah. And knowing the history is important too. She has a terrible history with police, right? And so to see that mural, it's almost offensive. But had it come from another source, again, where that's your capacity and you don't have a history of anti-Blackness and you're not out here, you know, sending the police in Black neighborhoods, love to see it. But I don't love to see that from everybody. Don't love to see that from her, personally.
No, that's an excellent point. And I encourage folks to read up on this. I know in the past, 12 hours, there's been, you know, many articles written on specifically this mural and the long-term impact. So I think there's a lot of reading out there. I think I'd encourage folks to read. I'd like to end by 9 p.m. Eastern, so hopefully 2 more questions and then we'll wrap it up. If folks have questions, please enter in the chat. We can use it for next time as well. How do we talk to our children about this issue? Many folks in this call and target audience for this group are people who either recently had children or they will have children in the next 10 years. How do we communicate this topic with them so that we don't raise another ignorant or arrogant or both generation?
I think that one of the most important things, so Sister Hidaya made some good points earlier about reading to your children. There are authors who are making very intentional, very beautiful, and very, just conscious of the mental development of children, the brain development of children, books and literature that explain these kinds of things to children, right? That's a good and important first step. Also, just having the conversations. A lot of our previous generations messed up because they weren't having these conversations, right? They didn't name racism in their homes. They didn't name systemic oppression in their homes. So you get to college and you're like, what? White privilege? I remember at University of Notre Dame, one of our administrators created a course on white privilege. And it was like, there was so much outrage and backlash, and it made national news because so many students were outraged. But had these conversations been happening, had you heard white privilege before and knew it was a thing, you wouldn't be so upset right now. And now you're having this visceral reaction because you're so upset. And so having the conversations is important, and also keeping in mind that your children are hearing the news. Your children are seeing these things. Your children go to school and often witness racism, right? And so not having those conversations is failing them because they're going to learn or mislearn somewhere else, right? So we send our children to school and they don't have the opportunity to say, this is how you stand up when bullying happens. This is what you say when you see these things. This is why you need to befriend the Black students in your school, right? We don't do these things. They grow up and they become silent perpetuators of it, where it's like, well, I'm not racist, but you're not anti-racist either. And so having those conversations is super important, because knowing that your children will be socialized one way or the other. And it's our job as the parents to do that socialization, but also knowing that our children are often smarter than we think. They're so smart. They're so smart. And so knowing that we can't coddle them, we can't insulate them from these things forever, because again, they out in the world. You send them somewhere during the day, except for right now during coronavirus. But outside of this, you're sending them. So I can't wait to send my kids somewhere, y'all. You're sending them somewhere during the day, inshallah. And if you're not, you will be soon, right? And so not trying to insulate them from these things is not a reality, and it does more harm than good. So just, if you gotta fumble your way through it, fumble your way through it. If you gotta feel your way through it, read some books yourself, find some documentaries, but have the conversation. That's the most important thing. Not having them is a failure, and it's so harmful. We can't hear you.
Yeah, you're muted, Rizika.
Thank you, sir. Alhamdulillah, we have a team, doing all these things behind the scenes. Sister, did you have any? Do either of you have any final closing words before we wrap out our discussion?
You want to go first, okay? Good?
No, y'all let me go first all night.
Okay. The respect thing, I promise. But no, I was just gonna say, like, these are not going to be easy conversations, right? Whether you're Black or not, these are not easy conversations for anybody to have. So please do not feel like just because we're here and talking to you about it, it's like the words we're saying, well, yeah, just talk to your parents or talk to your elders. It's not easy, it's awkward, it's uncomfortable. Nobody really wants to talk about it, right? But we have to, because the conversations are what inspire action, or so we hope, right? If we don't talk about it, we won't get anywhere. So this is a first step, but we cannot stop here, okay? So take the conversations to your homes, and then from there, inshallah, we're able to inspire action in our communities, in the states that we live in the country, inshallah, and the world, right? But it starts right here. It starts with you, and then your family, and then the greater family that you're a part of, whether it's your Islamic center or the state or the community, whatever it is. We have to start somewhere. Please do do not stop here. And I know we're going to have other conversations about these kinds of things, but even with those, you still can't stop with hearing, you know, these conversations happen. Actively try to take it further, push back at a lot of these things that are happening.
Thank you.
That's all I've got. Okay.
I think also, so in a, that is the most important advice, you know, to keep the conversations going, to hold space. A huge and important form of activism is holding space for conversation, right? That is a form of activism to say, I'm gonna, because there's an opportunity cost. I took up some of your time tonight, right? We took up an hour and a half of your time, right? That and this technology and everything else that we took up, right? That is a form of activism to say, I'm gonna take some of y'all time, I'm gonna take some of y'all technology, I'm gonna take some of y'all funding, whatever it is, to hold space, right? Also, another important thing is, you know, those of us who have proximity to institutions, whether you're a student in a school and you're part of a student organization, they owe y'all money. Schools have to give student organizations money. And so using your access to all sorts of resources, whether the resource is access to funding from your school, funding from your masajid, the resource of being able to talk to someone who's involved in politics, those are all important. So really take a stock of the resources that you have access to, right? Whether it's monetary resources, whether it is you have a blog, right? But redirecting all of our resources, again, time, energy, Instagram posts, all these things have opportunity costs. And so when we redirect those resources, it is a great way for us to dismantle these oppressive systems. But yeah, I just want to echo that, like, continuing these conversations is so important. And it's the most important thing, because without these conversations, we can't come up with the action plans. Without these conversations, we can't begin to get rid of the cognitive dissonance surrounding how we are implicit in these things. We can't begin to check our own bias. We can't begin to analyze our relationship to white supremacy and white privilege until we continue to have these conversations. And so thank you for holding this space and being part of this conversation, and creating this as a series, because it's so important and it changes the way we think. And when you change the way you think, your vibrational frequencies change, the way you show up in the world changes, the way you interact with people changes, the way your internal dialogue looks changes. And that's important too, right? So check in with your internal dialogue, because that reflects your implicit biases too. Conversations you have with other people are important, but the conversations you have with yourself are very important. And the conversations you have with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are the most important. Check them conversations too. Make sure you're directing some of that energy towards anti-racism, right? Talk to Allah about this. It's very important. Allah has the answers, and inshallah we can be a vessel for sending those answers forward. But your conversation with Allah got changed too.
No, you ended it, I think, in the best way possible. You know, you mentioned that the conversation with yourself, that's education, right? That's the whole purpose of, you know, this first part of this series, because you want to go protest, you want to go riot. If you don't know what you're protesting or what you're writing about, it's just exercise. I'm moving my arms, I'm breaking a sweat. Like that's it. That's what it is. So, you know, having that education is so important. Alhamdulillah. It looks like the chat, I haven't had a chance to read it, but it looks like the chat is fire. There's a lot of resources coming along, so that's fantastic. Before I conclude, I really want to give a shout out and a special thank you to the different organizations that helped co-sponsor this program. You know, first we had the Islamic Education Center of Maryland. It's the Islamic Center in Potomac, Maryland. We had the Imam Ali Association in Michigan, the Mosque and Community Center. And we had the Dallas Youth Group in Texas. You know, this program would not have been possible without them. I know Brother Amir posted their Instagram handles on the chat. Please go and follow them. They have great programming. Inshallah, we look forward to collaborating with them in the future. A comment was made. Does mohebban plan on continue doing these events? Yes, you know, we've inshallah dedicated ourselves to doing at least 2 more of these programs. And then, you know, continue the conversation, other methodologies as well. You know, we recognize that we have a role to play, and our role, at least for now, we would like to be on education, right? Because education is universal. Right? It's not a, you know, Democrat versus Republican. It's not a, you know, black versus white. It's understanding what is at the core of the issue. And education is universal. And that's fundamentally the most important thing. Because you can't argue with the facts. You can't argue with the literature. And understanding these is how you then, you know, be able to unify the ummah, unify people, you know, when it comes to race, religion, whatnot, by having understanding and speaking with the experts. So inshallah, we'll have these programs, continually. Mohebban-e-Fatemeh is a youth group based in, Maryland. We've been around since 1996. Alhamdulillah, we've been doing a lot of programs, and we highly encourage you to follow us if you benefited from this program, so we can benefit from your presence in future programs as well. If you have feedback for us, please email us. It's at mohebbancoordinators@gmail.com. We are a group, dedicated to improving ourselves, right? We appreciate all the constructive criticism and feedback you all give us, so that we can further educate ourselves and be able to improve our own strategies, our own programming. So if you have feedback for us, please email it there. And then finally, last and most importantly, I'd like to really thank our three presenters, Sister Niciah, Sister Hidaya, and Sister Zahra. Thank you so much for contributing your thoughts and your wisdom and your experiences and your words to our audience. Alhamdulillah, I think we had a phenomenal program. Inshallah, we'd like to continue having these. Inshallah, this doesn't stop, right? As you mentioned, we need to continue this discussion, continue, moving forward. And inshallah, this is a good place to restart this discussion. So with that, inshallah, we will see you soon.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Thank you all so much.